Thank you for the introduction. I should also mention I've worked with a couple graduate students who have done pretty significant work on the project. Daniel Silofsky, who's actually now a professor in England, as well as Zach Heppel, who was a master's student who worked under my supervision and has recently graduated. So the focus of the research has been looking at, it really started with looking at violence, but it's sort of developed into looking at other forms of aggression and harassment in minor hockey in Canada, looking at how common it is, the forms that it's taking, who's impacted by it, what the implications are. And I think it fits nicely with the panel that just presented, because there's certainly a lot of implications for game officials, as well as why it's happening and what could be done to sort of prevent it to some extent, or to the best extent possible. There's been three main phases of the research. The first phase was a legal case analysis where we used public reports of different acts of violence. And in this case, it was physical violence that we're looking at, that's defined as assault in the Criminal Code of Canada. So we looked at 65 different legal cases. So that's the starting point. Then we looked at code of conduct policies within minor hockey associations across the country. We looked at 58 different policies, looking at what's in there, and then talking to people about their effectiveness. So the third phase is the major phase of the study, where we did 122 interviews with hockey stakeholders, minor hockey stakeholders across the country, including former hockey players, coaches, referees, lots of parents, and also arena workers, team administrators. So really lots of people to try to get at answering those questions that we had. So the starting point was really figuring out what is happening, what are the different forms it's taking, who is being impacted by it. And so what we found was, first of all, in doing the legal analysis, it looked as though there was a significant degree of physical violence occurring. But then when we got into actually talking to people, doing the interviews, most people indicated that they had seen some physical violence, but that for the most part, it was more what could be called verbal aggression and harassment, intimidation, threats of violence, specifically targeted towards certain groups of people. So the most common forms being parents in the stands verbally harassing officials, and to a slightly lesser extent, coaches. So those were the sort of two main targets. The other was parents getting into altercations with one another. And one of the interesting aspects is that a lot of those altercations were on the same team. So parents on this, with players on the same teams, getting into arguments with one another, but also, of course, across teams. There were some instances of physical violence involving adult spectators and players, as well as a lot of what was understood as sort of harassment of young athletes. And one of the, I think, interesting findings of the study has been just how young the age groups are that this is prevalent. It's really almost at younger age groups, certainly than we expected to find, where it's happening starting around 7 years old, that some of this is happening, including physical violence, and then kind of peaking around 11 to 12 years old. So at pretty young age groups, in part, and I'll get into some of the contributing factors that we've seen, is I think it's where parents are most involved, and in some cases become over involved. There's also some examples of arena workers having to get involved and being on the receiving end of harassment and violence, security guards, as well as some destruction of property, so moving it away from just people. So in terms of how common is it, we didn't do an advanced statistical analysis. It's largely qualitative work, but we asked the 122 participants. Of those, every participant said they had seen forms of physical violence occurring, but that it wasn't commonplace, that they might, over 10 years, they might see it happen 1 or 2 times. Whereas in terms of verbal harassment, intimidation, threats being made. Most said that this is just an everyday occurrence, that it's not all parents engage in this activity, but typically there'd be a parent or a group of parents on a team, and that certain teams are more known for having that kind of conduct or behavior amongst the parents in certain locations. Although we never really sort of nailed down a particular, you can't say there's these geographic hotspots, but certainly a lot of parents felt that there were, and coaches and referees felt there were these sort of hotspots in certain areas where things are much worse than in other areas. So they all thought there was a high prevalence in terms of verbal harassment. All participants thought that it was a significant enough of an issue that something needs to be done, that there needs to be change in minor hockey in Canada to remedy the issue. The other thing I will say, and it sort of ties to the last panel, is one of the interesting findings was in terms of who's most likely to leave the sport because of it or experience really adverse impacts. And where we thought maybe it would be athletes, young athletes in particular, that wouldn't handle what was going on. Well, there were very few reports of athletes leaving the sport because of the conduct of people in the stands, and particularly parents in the stands. Although that might be a sort of somewhat of a limitation of our sampling and research design, because we talked to the players that we talked to were adults reflecting back on when they were younger. And so they're ones that stayed in the sport and they weren't necessarily aware of, and other participants weren't aware of people who left. What we did see is a lot of reports of referees and coaches as the two main groups that would drop out of participating in minor hockey altogether because of the emotional difficulties of dealing with aggressive parents. Most participants, they didn't say that they would drop out. They would talk about their own emotional challenges dealing with it, but they knew others that had and were concerned that this was an issue. The other group that was likely to leave the sport are some parents that wouldn't necessarily take their children out of the sport, but it might be that like a parent simply says, I can't go to my child's games anymore. So the child is kind of left on their own because the parent just can't interact in that space anymore because it's become too toxic, too hostile. So one of the main areas that we have been looking at, and I will say we're sort of year 3, I think, in the project. We've done the interviews and we're still at the point of kind of coding them and working through it. So it's not finalized at this point, but a lot of the work we're doing right now is exploring some of the contributing factors or reasons for why this is occurring. And in large part, we're looking at what did the participants themselves say about why it was occurring. And in some cases, sort of applying sort of existing concepts and theories to what they're saying to try to capture it in a clear way. The most common reason that hockey stakeholders cited for why they think there's parental aggression occurring is because of over-involved parents that have really unrealistic expectations of what their child is going to achieve. There's this sense, even at ages like 7 years old, that these are future NHL hockey players, and they get really invested in their child's sport and their progress through the sport, and can become very angry when things aren't going the way they anticipate. And if the coach isn't giving them the kind of ice time they think that their child deserves, it can incite anger and rage. And if they don't think they're being coached properly to get to that next level, or if officials are holding them back in some way with the calls they're making, can lead to sort of a hostile environment. Tied to that, I think, is there's oftentimes reports of parental entitlement, and that within the power hierarchy of minor hockey in Canada, a lot of people reported that it's actually the parents that are holding the balance of power because they're paying the fees, and coaches feel that their associations aren't necessarily behind them, and referees feel that there isn't a sort of support structure behind them. When parents are getting angry, there's a sense of You can't really direct negativity towards the parents, discipline towards parents, because they're the ones paying the bills. They're the ones that are sort of driving minor hockey in a sense. And so it comes with a degree of entitlement, and many parents are exploiting that to some extent. One of the really interesting findings, I think, of the study has been that of the cases we've looked at and of the reports we've received, the vast majority are perpetrated by men, or the belief is that it's men that are engaged in the aggressive acts. There's only, of the 65 legal cases, only one of them involved a woman. And other aspects that I think are interesting that are tied to that is the vast majority of those men who are engaged in it are also former high-level hockey players themselves, who have now sort of shifted into the position of being a hockey dad, and they're sort of raising their child and sort of wanting them to achieve at least as much, if not significantly more, than what they've achieved. So there's certain masculinity issues at play that we're certainly exploring right now. Participants didn't talk in terms of these masculinities, but they certainly talk in terms of like men and tough guys and masculine persona, that sort of thing. But I think there's also elements of not being able to sort of separate what was possible as a hockey player and what's permissible on the ice versus now sitting in the stands and having to occupy a different role. So there's certainly something really interesting there, I think. There's also, I think, a kind of flip side to that, in that there's some hockey dads that are the very opposite, and they report that they can't believe why others are like that, because they understand that, in their view, the norms better, and wouldn't engage in those types of activities. I think I'm sort of running short on time, so I'll just try to move quickly. The other big thing that stakeholders talked about is tolerance that's in place for parental aggression when it does occur, and that when people do come forward with reports, like coaches, referees, that they don't have the backing of organizations. And some organizations that we talk to go even further than just simply not doing anything and sort of silencing the issue, but to an extent even promoting this kind of behavior. And there's one example where an organization has set up a bingo game at minor hockey events, where there's one dad that's really gets heated and outraged and yells out different things, offensive things, during games. And so that's like on the bingo board, and different parents have that. And then as he yells it out, they do it. And then one of the parents wins the bingo game. So it's sort of part of the like culture of that organization. And tied to that is also a lot of people mentioned that where an organization has a coach that's sort of out of control and aggressive, it tends to sort of create a culture of parents also engaging in those similar ways. So they're sort of modeling the behavior of the coach. The other thing, and I think there's lots of little contextual triggers that we're also exploring and looking at. The biggest is probably where alcohol is served in some minor hockey in games and tournaments in Canada. That's where we see some of the most extreme examples of violence, but also in general, a lot of the cases involve alcohol, people drinking before the game, people with substance abuse issues. So there's that element. There's also things that people report around things happening on the ice, escalating things in the stands. So if a referee is perceived as missing a major call that leads to an injury, things can spill out into the stands where people get overly involved. In terms of implications of the research, participants really spoke to a need to change hockey culture in Canada. And of course, we see this on a broader sense, particularly around sexual violence in sport right now, a lot of discussion, but I think it extends beyond that, this sort of winning at all costs mentality. There was a perception that we need to move away from that and focus on health and well-being of athletes and their long-term development. There's a concern that even though policies exist, they're not being enforced, they're not consistent across organizations, and they're not inclusive enough of all stakeholders. There's sort of emphasis on athletes and coaches, but a lot of people are impacted by aggressive behaviors in hockey, as well as a perception that there needs to be more training, better training, and that training needs to be constant and consistent, not just a sort of one-off that one parent attends one year, but that it's continued training and involvement of different hockey stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Curtis. I was fascinated by your discussion and the paper that I read, and I have a few questions for you from my own questions, and then we'll obviously take questions from those who are attending. So thank you again for this really fascinating research. And as I mentioned, or it's mentioned here, I'm the Safe Sport Lead with Sport Nova Scotia. So I have a particular interest in creating safe and welcoming and inclusive environments. And I think one of the things we talk about, and you certainly mentioned in your paper, is engaging all stakeholders, and that notion that everybody has a role to play. And so this is really interesting, this research that's coming out. One of the things that was fascinating to me was the age, the 7 to 12. I'm guessing that you mentioned it was a surprise to you, but maybe you could sort of elaborate on what you had thought was going to come out. And so again, that to me was really interesting, the 7 to 12 age group and the parents of those young athletes.
Yeah,
do you have any comments on what you had thought was going to come up?
Yeah, I think what we had sort of anticipated was that the stakes would get higher as there'd be older age groups become more competitive, and then that would sort of fuel more aggression, violence in the stands. But interestingly, it seems that sort of hyper competitiveness actually seems to start at a much younger age. And also, I think it's part of that like over involvement of parents, and maybe parents sort of learning the norms, and they're sort of in that transition period of many of them are still maybe playing men's league and coming out of the sport while simultaneously then sitting in the stands. And it's maybe a difficult transition process for at least some, and I certainly want to say for all athletes in that position, but certainly some.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard of, certainly in our region, is this notion of putting a fifth ref or an official in the stands. Have you heard of that? And if you have or haven't, do you have any thoughts? And certainly has come up in some of the discussions I've been involved with.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Participants didn't talk about it as like a possible solution, but I think it would be things that they did talk about, I think would be important, because oftentimes that work falls on like an arena worker that's not what they're trained to do. That's not in their job description, but they're the person that falls on, of breaking up fights, escorting people out, things like that. So I think certainly if there were people that's what they were there to do, could be beneficial both in reacting to it, but also maybe helping to prevent it to some extent.
As the questions continue to come in, I'm going to continue with some here. Do you think that preseason education or training with coaches and parents and athletes could help to promote emotionally safe hockey environments? And I noticed that your research may extend to other sports, which I might ask you about. But right now, for emotionally safe hockey environments, if there's preseason education or handouts or whatever, what would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think definitely. And that's what, like, consistently across participants, they said that's like a necessity. And I think the key part was, I think a lot of parents had participated in like a 1 hour meeting. And so there's some of that happening, but there was a perception that it needs to be more consistent, more constant, and that everyone must be involved, that you can't just like send the mom to the meeting and the dad's like not there, and then the dad shows up at the game, and that's like where problems are at. So that all parents must agree to certain codes of conduct and be involved in the training process.
And this sort of goes back to that initial comment that I have, that all stakeholders, when it comes to creating safe and welcoming and inclusive environments, all stakeholders across the board, across sports, need to be involved and need to be putting forth that effort to make sure that we prevent maltreatment in sport. We do have a great question from the chat box, so if you bear with me. The comment is, first, thank you for such an interesting presentation. Did your participants have any suggestions of how to rectify the power imbalance that gives parents so much power and entitlement? And also, does your research team or you have any suggestions for this?
Yeah, I think for the most part, they just noted it as an issue, but I think just sort of reading into other things that they said is there's this sense that their organization backs the parents, not them, when there's a dispute, and that certain parents, particularly those that like donate tracksuits to the team and things like that, that they can kind of do what they want within the organization because nobody wants that person out of the organization because they want the tracksuits. And so I think like building from that would be for organization to really get behind a focus on player well-being, official well-being, coach well-being, and be less concerned about tracksuits or less concerned about the parents and how they sort of finance minor hockey to some extent. But of course, I imagine that's a difficult task in the sense that they need some of that financing to be able to continue.
Thank you. And I know we're going a little bit, we have a few more minutes. So there is another question from the chat box. To what degree do you think sport as an identity component plays into the trends of violence in spectators? I think that's a really interesting question. I know that we're doing a lot of work out east with youth and their identity wrapped up in as a student athlete and so forth. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments. Again, I'll just phrase it again. To what degree do you think sport as an identity component plays into the trends of violence in spectators?
I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I like fully understand it, but I think certainly there's something to, like, as I said, precarious masculinities, like masculine identity formation amongst former players, now hockey dads, and maintaining that sort of tough guy persona, not being able to kind of let that simply drop, to be focused on their child's just well-being and being calm in the stand is sort of this real identity shift for them from one role into another that I think needs to be looked at in more detail, and sort of some of the thinking around training and education should maybe focus on how to sort of help that transition along better.
The answers are fabulous. I know that I am excited to learn. I know in your paper you talk about further research, and I certainly will probably be reaching out to you with some questions in terms of my own work, and looking at other sports and looking at how we can continue to move forward and address this issue. And just cognizant of the time, so I'm going to take this moment to thank you, thank the people who are watching, and I look forward to hearing further and from the other presentations. So thank you very much, Curtis, and thank you everybody for being a part of this today.